bit of a white rabbit in my life, where
Timothy Leary.
Timothy Leary, and I would have an experience with him that wasn't very deep or profound, except that it would launch me kind of in a new direction. And for instance, as I was in college and I had been studying meditation, I've been meditating, and I actually went to hear him speak because I kind of thought it might be just entertaining. And instead what I got was a very enlightening experience that kind of answered some questions that had been in the back of my mind that had been growing out of my meditation practice. And it was at that point when a couple of things that he said to me launched me toward California. One of them was, "Go west, young man." And I think it was within a month I was headed out to California.
Right.
And when I landed in California, the first day I was there, I met people, I met people who would then be relative to me meeting Timothy Leary the next time, although I didn't even know it at that point. But my first encounter with John Lilly was at a party that I went to that I knew Timothy Leary was going to be at.
Okay.
And
so what year are we talking?
This would be probably in about 1979, in the late 70s.
Okay.
I moved to California in 1976, and this was somewhere in the late 70s. I'd been experimenting. Well, let me tell you a little bit about my background. When I was 13 years old, I had, that was about the time when the flower children were around,
right.
and
68,
LSD started coming about, and I heard about this as a kid, and
Where
I
were you
was
growing
fascinated. I was in South Florida,
okay,
on the east coast of the United States, and
right.
I heard about this LSD stuff, and it sounded fascinating to me, that people would ingest this and then see things that weren't there, hallucinate, and you know, it just was intriguing to me. I'd always had an interest in psychology, but you know, like most people who are interested in psychology, they're mostly interested in figuring themselves out.
Sure.
So that was kind of where I was coming from, but still I was drawn to this idea that there was another reality that you could experience,
right, right.
you know, by taking some kind of substance. But at the same time, I had a kind of intuitive understanding that I wasn't going to do this as a recreational thing, in the sense of just partying. It was going to be more of a recreational thing in terms of recreating myself.
Right.
I didn't really understand what that meant. I just had a sense about it.
You're not being brought up in a kind of religious background, are you?
Well, not really. I was raised a Protestant Presbyterian, but it wasn't until I was ready to leave the church that I even questioned what I was supposed to be believing as a Presbyterian. What makes us Presbyterian? I had no kind of
They didn't really
idea.
teach you religious studies very well.
Not really, and especially not comparative things. I heard what the minister said, and, you know, he talked about Jesus, and, you know, but for me
But he
it was
didn't talk
kind of
about
like,
Buddha or anything, or Krishna or that.
no.
No.
And it was mostly like just a formula to, this is what you're going to do, this is what you should do, this is how you should live your life. And it was just generally a moral thing. And then, you know, becoming a teenager, it's going, wait a minute, I didn't pick this.
Right.
You know, I'm going there because my parents brought me there. And one of the things I learned about Presbyterianism is that they believe in predestination. I had to ask what that was.
Right.
You know, what is it? What is it that we believe? What does predestination mean? And do I believe that? So, you know, it was about then that I said, well, this is silly.
Right.
You know, this religion isn't coming from me.
It's like a partial
being
truth that's then distorted into a whole truth.
Right, and it's been
Yeah.
imposed on me.
Right.
So I kind of left.
And going to California was kind of part of that, claiming your freedom.
Well, no, that was more when I was a teenager. Then I went to college. I was a pre-med major, or as a pre-med in a pre-med program majoring in psychology.
Okay. Pre-med means you're about to train to be a doctor. If
Yes,
you want.
I'm in a track to go to medical school with
Right.
a major in psychology because I was intending to be a psychiatrist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, how interesting.
Well, it was interesting, but in the same thing, it was more of a practical
Because
thing.
Timothy Leary was doing that, wasn't he?
Right. Well, he was in Harvard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
where did you go? In Florida?
Yeah, I went to a state school in Florida, but it was a state school that was junior and senior level.
Right.
So in other words, you would go to maybe a junior college for your first 2 years and then go to that college to do your final 2 years.
Right.
It was a new kind of concept, but they let me go in. There was a certain test that I took that allowed me to go there for 3 years instead of doing 2 at a lower level college and then 2 at there. So I did all my work at that level, and I fulfilled all my academic requirements in the first 2 years. So I had a year that I could play around.
Oh, wow.
And I started taking film and art and photography and all the stuff I really loved.
Right.
You know, and it was there that I met people in the communications department who informed me that yes, indeed, you could get a job in the film business. And so all of a sudden, the idea of going to med school for a bunch of more years and, you know, following that track seemed less appealing. And then when I met Timothy Leary and had that experience, I said, that's it, I'm going to California to make movies.
Oh, okay. So that was the professional thing.
Right.
Right.
So,
and just to finish responding to my question, you met John Lilly at that party.
well, I didn't quite meet him at that party. I had an encounter with him at that party.
Right.
I went to that party through a friend that synchronistically was at the house that I first landed at when I came to California. And I remember going to that party, and I wasn't able to speak to Tim much, but while milling around the party, I was actually walking along a path that was on a cliffside in Malibu.
Oh, wow.
And as I walked past these two kind of older gentlemen, and I was in my 20s, and I never partied with old people, and so it was kind of a weird feeling anyway. And then as I passed these two gentlemen, I heard one of them say to the other, or I heard somebody say, "We must be crazy, a couple of old acid heads like us standing so close to the edge of this cliff." And it was such a strange thing, and I turned around. One of them was staring right at me when he said it. And who are these guys? And coincidentally, I ended up getting a ride home to my neighborhood from an editor of High Times magazine.
Okay, yeah, I remember that thing.
And
yeah.
and I asked him. I said, "Hey, who was that guy?" And I kind of described him. And he goes, "Oh, well, if it's the guy I'm thinking you're talking about, it was John Lilly, you know, the dolphin guy."
Right.
I don't know who that is. It ended up that I found out later that it was John Lilly and Albert Hoffman.
Oh, okay.
The man who had discovered the effects of LSD at Sandoz.
Oh, the Swiss
pharmaceutical, right.
Oh, right. No, he was a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
That must have been quite a party then.
It was a mind-blowing kind of party, yeah, for sure.
Right.
That was my first encounter with John.
Yeah.
Then I had an interesting other encounter. I went to this convention that was called a New Earth Expo. That was kind of a convention for alternative thinking.
Whole Earth Catalogue type people.
Yes, exactly. A lot of they would have had a big booth there.
Yeah.
Earth Catalog. And but when I was there, I bought 2 things. I went to 2 booths where I made purchases. One was I purchased 2 hours in a flotation tank, which I found existed. I'd heard about these things in college, like I'd heard about R.D. Laing. You know, these the things are part of my education in psychology. But I had no idea you could actually go in one.
Right.
So when I found this out, it was like, yes, please, I want to go. And it was in Beverly Hills. They had opened a tank center where they had tanks for rental for an hour at a time.
Wow. You
So
don't get that in London.
Oh, I think they do, actually.
Maybe now they've got them. Yeah.
They've got them pretty much a lot over Europe now. But anyway, so I bought that not knowing that the other thing they were selling there was a book, The Deep Self, written by John, that John had designed the tank that they were selling, and his book, The Deep Self, was all about isolation tank experiences, and that he had pioneered sensory deprivation studies.
Yeah.
Right. And also not knowing, but finding out later that he experimented on himself with those tanks. His whole quest in the early part of his life was that he wanted to find the link between the brain and the mind.
Right.
And part of that was his work doing electrode studies with the brain. He was the first one to introduce electrodes into the brain and stimulate them to find what the brain did and where these avenues were. And he in fact invented the Lilly waveform, which was an electronic pulse that didn't damage the cortex.
Right.
That's still used in prosthetic devices to this day.
Right. What was his training? Was he a brain scientist or
he was an MD,
psychologist?
and he was a neuroscientist. He worked at the National Institute of Mental Health.
Okay.
And this is where he did a lot of his early work. And he did a little sidetrack into inventing high altitude respiration equipment in the early days of aerospace reaching space.
Right.
As people got higher and higher and higher, they needed
had
ways
to keep
of breathing.
Yeah.
And he was doing that, and that actually led him to led him to dolphins.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the dolphin thing, because he reckoned
he
he had communication, didn't he?
Well, he was really interested in intelligence.
Right.
And he longed to find an extraterrestrial intelligence. And when some of his fellow brain scientists came and told him that, actually Tursiops, bottlenose dolphins, have a brain that's 20% larger than human brains. And the reason they did that was because dolphins are conscious breathers. They have to make the choice to breathe because they live underwater. They're not like us. So whenever they would anesthetize them to do surgery, to look at their brains, while on a living dolphin, the dolphins would die because they've
got to be awake to breathe.
They've got to be conscious to breathe.
So what, do they not sleep?
Well, it's theoretically they have a two-part brain like we do, but they have no corpus callosum. There's no connector between the two.
Right.
So they have two independently operating brains.
So the one is the kind of autonomous thing that does when they sleep. That does
I think that they theorize, at least from what John told me, the theory was that they slept with one half of the brain at a time. So this half
with one eye open type of thing.
Kind of. It's hard for us to imagine, but one of the studies in Man and Dolphin, his book Man and Dolphin, they started noticing that the dolphins, when they were isolated from each other, they would give out a signature whistle, which is what they do out in the wild in murky water. They send out a little whistle that's their own whistle, their own tone.
Like their name type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, and it's akin to saying, "Hey, I'm here. Hey, I'm here. Hey, I'm here," and everybody knows those sounds. So all the pod knows where everybody is. And they would, while the hydrophones were off in the tanks, they would give out signature whistles. And as soon as they turned on the hydrophones so they could communicate with other dolphins in other tanks, they would have conversations. And the conversations would be in the form of whistles and clicks. Okay? So they started to notice that when they were recording all these sounds, they started to notice that there would be conversations of whistles where one dolphin would whistle, 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 and stop, and the other would whistle, 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 and stop. So it looked like human conversation, where there would be some little overlap, but not a whole lot, as they had a conversation. And then they realized that there was another conversation of clicks going on. That kind of thing. That was doing the same thing, but transposed against the other one was totally out of sync. So it was as if they were having two different conversations about two totally different things at the same time. At least that's what John surmised. So it's this incredibly.
So you got to know him fairly well, did you, over the years, and you talked to him about this?
Well, I probably talked to him less than received transmissions from him. It's really strange because
he would hold forth and you would listen.
Well, yeah, there were always a lot of people visiting. I practically lived at their house for a while.
Right.
I was good friends with their secretary, their kind of executive secretary, who lived down the street. They lived kind of on the outskirts of Los Angeles.
And what's happened? Is he and his wife both dead now? Or?
Yes. Yeah. Tony died actually in the mid-'80s, and then John died in 2001.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, while I was there, a lot of people would come to visit, a lot of scientists, and I wish I had it, but I taped a conversation with he and R.D. Lang one morning, and that was pretty outstanding.
That was at Lilly's place.
Yeah.
Okay, because he was a friend too.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's all there, kept in the cyber memory, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe.
Of the brain.
But it's funny because when I hear people talking about the center of the cyclone and things that John said, it says, yeah, that makes sense that John would say that, and it's things that I agree with, but I never read the center of the cyclone. And, I would...
I kind of, lived with it for a while in the late 70s. And the thing that I remember most from that book was his concept of the dyad. He believed, if I'm remembering rightly, that in relationships between human beings, if you're in a sacred relationship, like a love relationship, he called that a dyad, And so when two souls fuse in love, they become a more powerful kind of transmission-receiving device for the universe. And that's the natural state of human beings. We're supposed to be in a dyadic kind of partnership. And that influenced me in my journey exploring relationships and what is marriage, what is sacred sexuality, and that kind of stuff. Because I was celibate for 4 years consciously. Because, you know, I follow the yogic tradition that it's better to be celibate to be a scholar. And then I thought, no, this isn't right. If everybody did celibacy, the planet would die out of humans. So then I said, no, we should be doing sacred relationships, which is what I call a wisdom affair. And the term I use for that is a dyad, which is taken from John Lilly's book.
Ah.
So that's my kind of homage to his influence on me, really.
Well, if you don't mind, I have a question
Okay.
now, because now that we're talking about kind of monastic traditions and spiritual traditions,
Right.
I'm very interested in the way Druids would have taken to that idea of the dyad. How does that inform you as a Druid?
Right. It's a very interesting question. I mean, what we know of the Druids is that they were the sacred knowledge keepers of northwestern Europe, right, for thousands of years, going right back to the time of Stonehenge, Avebury, and there's about 800 stone circles in Britain. I mean, we're close to Kilmartin here in Argyll, which is one of the earliest